Imagine a morning in the spring of 1720 inside a narrow counting house on Threadneedle Street in London. The ledgers are thick, bound in calf leather, and the ink in them is still fresh. A clerk sits at his desk at 6 in the morning, not because he was told to, but because he cannot sleep. He has been awake for 3 nights, not from illness, not from grief, from arithmetic, because every number he writes in that ledger points in the same direction, and the direction terrifies him. Outside the window, the city has not yet stirred. The Thames is cold and pale in the early light. But in a few hours, the coffee houses will fill, and the same men who trusted him with these numbers will arrive carrying the same expression they have worn for 18 months now, that particular expression worn by people who have confused motion for progress, that face of someone who believes that because a thing is rising, it cannot fall. He closes the ledger, he puts it in the drawer. He does not speak about what he found. That silence, that single, private, professional silence, is where the story of the South Sea bubble truly begins. Not in the boardrooms of directors, not in the offices of ministers, not in the chambers of Parliament. It begins in the moment when one person who understood the numbers chose not to say them aloud because the social cost of saying them was greater than the personal cost of staying quiet. That is the architecture of every financial catastrophe ever constructed on human soil. Not the fraud alone, not the greed alone. The silence of the people who knew, coexisting with the confidence of the people who didn't. This is not simply a story about speculation. This is a forensic reconstruction of the first engineered market bubble in modern financial history. A deliberate, state-sanctioned, institutionally protected system designed to generate artificial wealth on paper, transfer real wealth in silence, and leave the consequences to those who believed the numbers were real. But if you follow the financial records left behind, the parliamentary testimony, the private correspondence of directors, the accounting remnants buried in archives across 3 centuries, a different story begins to emerge. This is not a story of sudden collapse. It is a story of gradual behavioral failure, disguised as national progress. Let us begin at the beginning. Not the beginning you were taught, but the real one. The year is 1711. England is exhausted. A decade of warfare against France, the War of the Spanish Succession, has hollowed out the treasury. The national debt stands at approximately £10 million, a figure that, in the context of early 18th century England, is not merely large, it is existential. The government cannot service its obligations. Creditors are nervous. Public confidence in sovereign finance is deteriorating, which is another way of saying that the social contract between the state and the people who lend money to the state is beginning to fracture. Into this fracture steps Robert Harley, the Earl of Oxford, and his financial architect, John Blunt. What they propose is elegant in the way that dangerous things often are. They will create a trading company, a monopoly, a company granted exclusive rights to trade with the Spanish colonies of South America, a region of legendary, almost mythological wealth. Silver mines, sugar plantations, commercial empire stretching across an entire hemisphere. The company is called the Governor and Company of Merchants of Great Britain Trading to the South Seas and other parts of America. History shortens this to the South Sea Company. The name is by design. It sounds enormous. It sounds distant and promising and rich. It sounds like the kind of thing that sensible, forward-thinking Englishmen would want to hold a piece of. But here is what the records show that the prospectuses did not. The trade rights that underpinned this company were almost entirely theoretical. The treaty with Spain that was supposed to authorize English trade in South American ports was contested from the beginning. The volume of trade actually permitted under the Asiento contract, the agreement allowing England to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies, was narrowly defined and diplomatically fragile. The silver mines of Peru were not accessible to English merchants. The commercial empire was, in practical terms, nearly non-existent. The South Sea Company was not a trading company that also issued stock. It was a financial instrument that also had the theoretical permission to trade. The stock was the product. The trade was the cover. This is the first and most important distinction in the forensic autopsy of what followed. The company existed primarily to absorb government debt. Creditors holding government obligations were offered the opportunity to exchange their debt for equity in the South Sea Company. The company would pay them dividends from trading profits. The government would pay the company interest. The circle appeared to close cleanly. But circles built on projections rather than operations do not close, they spiral. In the phase of expansion, which runs roughly from 1711 to late 1719, the behavioral signature is recognizable in retrospect and invisible in the moment. The public narrative around South Sea stock is carefully managed. Directors speak of imminent trading voyages. Ministers speak of commercial greatness. The press, which in early 18th century England was not entirely independent of the interests it covered, writes enthusiastically about the prospects of Spanish-American wealth. Ordinary people during this period experience something particular. They see stability. They see a company with royal backing, government affiliation, and respectable directors. They see a stock that rises slowly and steadily, the way things rise when they are genuinely valuable. They see their neighbors making money. They see the merchants and the gentry and the minor aristocracy discussing shares with the same casual confidence they once reserved for land. What they do not see is the gap between what the company claimed and what it actually earned. The trading voyages were limited. The profits from the Asiento were modest. The company's real income came almost entirely from government interest payments, not commerce. The wealth on the ledger was a financial mirage dressed in the language of empire, but in the phase of expansion, mirages are indistinguishable from oases, and the people who designed the mirage understood this perfectly. Now we enter 1720, the year the machine was switched on at full power. By early 1720, Parliament was considering the South Sea Company's bold new proposal. The company offers to absorb virtually the entire remaining national debt, somewhere between 30 and 50 million pounds sterling. In exchange, the company receives the right to issue new stock. The mechanism is complex, but the emotional logic is simple. The government debt disappears. The company grows. Everyone benefits. What the proposal does not make visible is the incentive structure embedded within it. Directors of the company hold stock. Ministers who approve the proposal hold stock. Members of Parliament who vote on the proposal hold stock, often stock that has been provided to them by the company in advance of the vote, at below market prices, with the understanding that if the proposal passes, the stock rises and the political beneficiaries profit. The parliamentary records show that bribes were paid. The historical consensus is careful about this word, but the mechanism is clear. Stock was allocated to powerful figures before they exercised power. That is, by any forensic standard, a corrupted decision-making process dressed as legislative procedure. In April of 1720, Parliament approved the South Sea Scheme. The stock immediately begins to rise. This is not a coincidence. It is a mechanism. The company management understood that investor confidence would follow regulatory approval. They had engineered the approval. They now engineered the confidence. The phase of distortion unfolded between April and August of 1720. In this phase, the behavioral signatures become extraordinary. South Sea stock rises from approximately £128 at the start of the year to over £1,000 by July. A tenfold increase in under 7 months. The mechanics behind this rise are revealing. The company offers subscription installments, meaning investors can purchase shares by paying only a portion of the price up front, with the remainder due later. This dramatically expands the pool of people who can participate. You do not need to be wealthy to buy into the illusion. You simply need enough for the first installment. This is the architecture of democratized speculation. It distributes the exposure widely while concentrating the actual ownership at the top. More revealing still is what the directors do during this period with something the records call money subscriptions, essentially loans made by the company to investors, secured against the very stock they were purchasing. The company lent people money to buy the company's own stock. The stock rose because demand rose. Demand rose because borrowed money made it possible to speculate without full capital. The borrowed money came from the company itself. The collateral was stock that only had value because the borrowed money was inflating it. This is a closed financial loop, a machine that feeds itself, a system that creates the appearance of value by converting credit into demand and demand back into the appearance of value. And it worked, for a while, the way all such mechanisms work for a while. At what point does confidence become a collective illusion instead of an economic reality? Think about that question carefully, because it is not a historical question. It is a present one. Drop your thoughts in the comments. During the summer of 1720, London changed. The coffee houses of Exchange Alley overflow with men who have never previously considered themselves investors. Women of the middle classes compare subscription certificates. Clergymen, physicians, widows, naval officers, and landed gentry, who once considered commerce beneath them all, reach for a piece of what appears to be the most obvious wealth generation mechanism in living memory. The company's directors, watching this, understand something that the ordinary investor cannot see. They understand the ceiling. They understand that there is no commercial operation underneath the stock price. There is only momentum, and momentum reverses. They begin quietly and systematically to sell. The records of share disposals in the summer of 1720 show a clear pattern. The people who designed the mechanism were liquidating their positions while simultaneously continuing to make public statements about the company's prospects. The public messaging and the private behavior were moving in opposite directions. This is the behavioral fingerprint of the wealth preservation layer in almost every financial collapse in recorded history. The architects know before the audience. The ordinary people of London in the summer of 1720 are experiencing something that has no name for them. They are living inside a status illusion. The ownership of South Sea stock has become socially significant. To not own it is to signal that you do not understand the moment, that you are not a modern commercial person, that you lack the sophistication to recognize an obvious opportunity. The social pressure to participate is built into the social fabric of the city. This is consumption theater operating at the level of finance. People are not purely making economic decisions. They are making identity decisions. The stock certificate is a social artifact before it is a financial one. It means something about who you are to hold it. This is the deepest architecture of the bubble, deeper than the debt conversion, deeper than the loans against stock. It is the social encoding of participation as identity. And it is deliberate. The directors understood that when people make decisions about who they are, not just about what they want, they will ignore warning signs for far longer than rational actors would. By mid-August, reality begins to press against the fiction. The company can no longer sustain the lending that has been propping up demand. Credit conditions tighten. Some investors begin selling. Prices waver. The wavering produces anxiety, and anxiety produces more selling, and more selling produces lower prices, and lower prices confirm the anxiety. The phase of collapse begins not with a single event, but with a shift in the aggregate emotional state of the market, from confident to uncertain, and then from uncertain to afraid. In September of 1720, the stock that had been trading above £1,000 fell below 200. By December, it is approaching its pre-mania levels. In under 4 months, somewhere between 80 and 90% of the paper wealth generated over the previous year is erased. The human aftermath is visible in the documents. There are letters from men who sold their land and their shops and their inventories to buy subscriptions. There are court records of debtors who owe money against stock that is now nearly worthless. There are parliamentary testimonies from widows whose trustees invested inheritance funds in the company. There are accounts of suicides. There is at least one documented case of a lord who goes to bed one night as a wealthy man and is found dead the next morning, his financial situation having reversed in the span of a week. But here is the element of the collapse that the standard histories underemphasize and the forensic record makes impossible to ignore. The directors of the South Sea Company were not simply lucky men who failed. They were sophisticated actors who understood, to varying degrees, that the valuation they were building was unsustainable and who took measurable steps to protect themselves before the public discovered this. The records show that at least several directors sold the majority of their holdings near the peak. Robert Knight, the company's cashier and the man who managed the bribery infrastructure, fled to France before the parliamentary investigation concluded. He took with him the company's Green Book, a private ledger recording all the stock distributed to political figures, the most incriminating financial document of the entire episode. He lived abroad comfortably for decades. The behavioral architecture of the survival strategy follows a pattern visible across centuries of financial collapse. First, early positioning, acquiring the assets before the public is made aware of their potential. Second, control of the narrative, shaping public confidence through press and political channels. Third, private liquidation while maintaining public confidence. Fourth, geographical or legal distance from the consequences. Fifth, the use of complexity, legal, financial, and jurisdictional, to delay or prevent accountability. This is not a medieval story. It is not even a specifically British story. It is a template that will reappear in recognizable form in the credit mobilier scandal in the United States in the 1870s, in the Florida land bubble of the 1920s, in the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s, and in the structured debt markets of the early 2000s. The details change. The behavioral sequence does not. Let us examine the psychological forensics, because the collapse of the South Sea market is not only an institutional crime, it is a psychological case study of extraordinary precision. The first behavioral layer is herd dynamics. In Exchange Alley in 1720, individual judgment was replaced by social consensus. When everyone you know holds an asset, when the barber and the bishop and the baronet all speak of it with the same easy confidence, the cognitive energy required to be the dissenting voice is enormous. The social and psychological cost of saying this is not what it appears to be, rising with every person who enters the market. By midsummer of 1720, to say that South Sea stock was overvalued was to claim that virtually everyone around you was wrong. Very few people can sustain that claim under that kind of social pressure. The second layer is status preservation. The early adopters, the wealthy and connected men who entered the market in 1711 and 1712 when the company was new, had by 1720 built their identities around their financial acuity. Exiting the position before the peak would have required them to acknowledge either that they did not know when the peak would come, or worse, that the thing they had championed publicly was not what they had represented it to be. Status preservation made late selling rational for individuals and catastrophic for the system. The third layer is institutional pride. The Bank of England, private commercial banks, and established merchant houses watched the South Sea Company's rise with a complicated mixture of envy, competitive anxiety, and grudging participation. Many of them extended credit to investors because not extending credit meant losing business to institutions that would. The incentive structure pushed every actor in the financial system toward participation, even when private doubts existed. The fourth and perhaps most revealing layer is what the historical psychologists call normalization of the new normal. Every week that passed without collapse made collapse feel less likely. Every month of rising prices was not merely a month of profit. It was a month of evidence that the skeptics were wrong. Human cognition does not update the probability of tail risks based on the absence of those risks. It tends to reduce those probabilities. The longer nothing goes wrong, the less likely people are to believe something is going wrong. This is not irrationality. It is a predictable and well-documented feature of how pattern recognition works under conditions of unfamiliar assets. And the people who designed the South Sea mechanism may not have understood behavioral economics as a formal discipline, but they understood these patterns intuitively. The structure of the subscription system, the use of social endorsement through political and royal association, and the gradual escalation of valuations to create momentum are the tools of a mechanism designed by people who understood how groups of humans behave when confronted with an apparent opportunity. The systemic fragility was not a flaw in the design. It was a feature. The collapse was, in a specific sense, planned. Not necessarily planned for a precise moment, but planned in the structural sense that a system built entirely on credit against paper assets has a mathematically predictable endpoint. The architects of the system were not unaware of this. They were simply positioned to survive it. This is the distinction between a failed experiment and a completed extraction. Share this video with one person you care about because this warning is too critical to keep hidden. Now, what survived the South Sea collapse? What patterns of financial behavior emerged with assets intact from the rubble of 1720? The historical record is instructive. Those who held land, not stock in land companies, but actual title to physical land whose fundamental value was not dependent on market confidence, survived relatively well. The gentry class that had participated in South Sea speculation but kept its core landholdings intact was shaken, but not destroyed. The merchant class that had traded its operating capital for subscription certificates faced far more severe consequences. Liquidity was the second survival mechanism. The individuals who maintained cash positions, who resisted the temptation of leverage, who kept at least a portion of their wealth in instruments they could access without reference to a market price, had options in the collapse that the fully invested did not. They could purchase distressed assets at collapsed prices. They could continue to operate businesses that leveraged investors could not. Liquidity in a deflating environment is not simply a conservative strategy. It is optionality. It is the ability to act when others cannot. Debt avoidance was the third pattern. The investors who had purchased subscriptions on installment, who had borrowed against their holdings, who owed money to the company or to intermediary lenders, faced not only the loss of their investment, but the continuation of their obligations. The debt survived the asset collapse. The people who had avoided leverage lost paper profits. The people who had used leverage lost real money that they continued to owe after the paper had ceased to exist. Institutional skepticism, not cynicism, but a carefully maintained analytical distance from systems that offered returns without clear operational foundations, was perhaps the rarest and most valuable behavioral trait of the period. The accounts that survive of individuals who declined South Sea participation are notable for a common thread. They were not smarter than the participants. Many of them explicitly acknowledge that they could not definitively identify the mechanism as fraudulent. What they maintained was an insistence on understanding the actual source of the return before committing capital. When the question, where do the profits actually come from in operational terms, had no clear answer, they declined to proceed. That question, where do the profits actually come from, is among the most powerful pieces of financial forensic equipment in any era. The modern parallel is not difficult to find, though it would be analytical overreach to draw direct equivalences between 1720 and any specific contemporary mechanism. What is visible across history is a behavioral pattern that recurs regardless of the specific instrument, credit expansion that dramatically widens the pool of participants without commensurate expansion in the productive capacity of the underlying asset. Social encoding of asset ownership as identity so that participation becomes a statement about who you are rather than simply an economic decision. Institutional architecture that allows originators to distribute exposure while maintaining informational advantages. Narrative management that lags reality so that the public story remains optimistic long after the private picture has changed. And finally, the predictable concentration of consequence among the people who entered last and trusted most. These patterns are not specific to the 18th century. They are not specific to equity markets. They are not specific to any one country or regulatory environment. They are structural features of any system in which asymmetric information meets democratized access and social encoding of wealth signals. The South Sea Company was not the last institution to understand this. It was simply the first to execute it at scale in a recognizably modern financial architecture. There is a particular detail in the aftermath of the collapse that remains among the most quietly devastating in the record. Parliament, facing the wreckage, passed legislation in late 1720 called the Bubble Act. The Bubble Act required any joint stock company to receive a royal charter before issuing shares. The legislation was framed as a reform, as a protection of the public against fraudulent schemes. What is less often discussed is that the South Sea Company, whose directors had lobbied for the act, was explicitly exempted from its provisions. The regulation that emerged from the collapse was, in a precise structural sense, designed and implemented by the institution whose behavior had caused the collapse. The same actors who had built the mechanism shaped the framework that was supposed to prevent it. The consequence was not the prevention of future speculative manias. It was the temporary suppression of competing vehicles, which inadvertently directed more capital toward the South Sea Company itself in the short term, before the ultimate collapse made even that impossible. There is no mystery in the behavior of institutions after financial crises. They shape the regulatory response to protect their own architecture. This is not a cynical observation, it is a structural one. Institutions that survive crises have, by definition, more operational capacity and political access than those that don't. The survivors shape the aftermath. The regulatory structure that emerges reflects, to a significant degree, the survival interests of the survivors. This does not mean reform is impossible. It means that understanding whose interests shaped the reform is as important as reading the text of the reform itself. Financial collapse is rarely sudden. It is the final visible moment of invisible decisions made over the years. The South Sea bubble did not begin in the summer of 1720 when prices peaked and reversed. It began in 1711 when a mechanism was constructed that was designed to generate paper confidence rather than commercial value. It began in the years when the gap between the public narrative and the operational reality was maintained not by ignorance, but by choice. It began every time someone sat with a ledger at 6 in the morning and found the silence easier than the truth. By the time the ordinary investors of London understood what had happened to their money, the system had already adjusted. The directors had sold. The cashier had fled. The Green Book was in France. The legislation had been shaped. The consequences had been distributed to the people who had trusted the signal without investigating the source. The tragedy of the South Sea bubble is not the wealth that was destroyed. Wealth was created and destroyed by the same mechanism, and the creation and destruction were not random. They were directional. Wealth moved from those who arrived late to those who departed early. It moved from those who trusted the public narrative to those who had written it. It moved from those who saw the stock as a financial asset to those who saw it as a social performance. The tragedy is not the collapse. The tragedy is the long period before the collapse, when every visible signal was being correctly interpreted by some and deliberately misrepresented by others, and the social structure of the moment made it nearly impossible to distinguish between them. The question that the South Sea forensic record leaves open is not what happened in 1720. It is what happens in every generation when a mechanism is constructed that separates the appearance of value from the source of value and then encodes that appearance in the social identity of ordinary people and then relies on the silence of those who understand the gap. The answer in 1720 was collapse. The question that remains is whether the answer has ever been anything else. If you found this investigation valuable, subscribe to the Sovereign Archive channel, where we continue our forensic work through the history of financial collapses, behavioral decay, and the hidden architecture of systemic fragility that has shaped human civilization across centuries. The record is always there. Most people just don't know how to read it.